Hello, I'm Dr. Tullio Palmerini. I'm an interventional cardiologist and I work in Bologna, in Italy.
I am Sripal Bangalore. I'm an interventional cardiologist at NYU School of Medicine in New York.
So, Sripal, today we are supposed to address a difficult issue regarding bare metal stent, second generation, third generation drug-eluting stent. Which one is the best? And I would like to start asking you this question. Now, there have been many randomized trials and meta-analysis suggesting that indeed the second generation drug-eluting stent, or at least some second generation drug-eluting stent, are associated with reduced rates of stent thrombosis as compared to bare metal stent. Do you think we have enough data to support this concept?
Yeah, absolutely. I think now is a time when we have data from hundreds of clinical trials, and at least going back at least a decade ago, drug-eluting stents, the first generation drug-eluting stents, were associated with increased risk of very late stent thrombosis. And that being said, I still see practitioners holding on to data from a decade ago and thinking that, given what happened with first generation stents, it's likely that the bare metal stents are actually safer. But the current set of data, if you look at the totality of data, it seems to support the notion that the second generation drug-eluting stents are actually safer, lower risk of stent thrombosis. In fact, there is data from bench testing, in vitro, in vivo models suggesting that if you look at inflammation around the bare metal stents as opposed to a fluoropolymer second generation drug-eluting stents, the inflammation is lower. If you look at thrombogenicity in vivo models, again, lower thrombogenicity with second generation fluoropolymer drug-eluting stents when compared to bare metal stents. And if you use that and look at clinical outcomes, again, number of randomized trials, you and I have published a couple of meta-analyses, all consistently showing one message, that the second generation, especially the fluoropolymer coated drug-eluting stents, are safer, lower risk of stent thrombosis. In many cases, if you pull all of these data, as you know, it's not just lowering stent thrombosis, but also reducing the risk of not only target vessel revascularization, but MI and eventually all-cause mortality.
So in this regard, I would like to ask you two questions. So the first one, so in some of your meta-analysis, you showed that for example, cobalt chromium everolimus eluting stent reduces the risk not only of stent thrombosis, but even myocardial infarction and cardiac mortality. But we have only one randomized trial, which is the North Stent trial, in which indeed it was confirmed that cobalt chromium everolimus eluting stent had lower rates of stent thrombosis than bare metal stent, but there was no difference regarding myocardial infarction or cardiac mortality. So how do you reconcile this one?
No, that's a great question. And again, just going back, back in the day when newer stents were being put on market, everybody would say we should not be expecting a difference in death or MI from these stents because they're not geared to do that. Unfortunately, that's no longer true because you really need a lot of patients to actually show a difference. So North Stent is a good example of a trial, and I always say this, stents can only reduce stent-related events. So stents can reduce your risk of stent-related death and stent-related cardiovascular death. So North Stent was powered to look for all-cause mortality reduction, but it really depends on what proportion of those all-cause mortality were actually stent-related. So if that proportion is very small, it would mean that you'll need really a large trial to show a difference in mortality which is powered for that stent-related events. In fact, we did this post-hoc analysis trying to look for optimal sample size to show a difference based on all of their stent-related events. It turned out that you need around 35,000 patients to be adequately powered. So it's good to see that North Stent is along the same lines, reduction in TVR and stent thrombosis. And I feel that the reason there was no difference in all-cause mortality is because it's vastly underpowered.
So, and the other question is, looking at all these data, do you think there is still a role with bare metal stent, for example, in high-risk bleeding patients, a patient that has to undergo a short duration of dual antiplatelet therapy or whatever?
Yeah, so I think that's a great question. So in my practice, I can tell you that I haven't used a bare metal in the last 5-7 years at all. And the real question to ask is, why do you want to use a bare metal stent in a high bleeding risk patients. It's mainly because you can get away with shorter DAPT. But if you look at all of the randomized trials, there are many trials looking at 3 to 6 months of DAPT versus longer term DAPT in patients with second generation drug-eluting stents showing, at least that, and the short duration, I mean, we can talk about power, etc., but at least it's safe. There are many more trials looking at 1 month duration of DAPT and also, 3 and 1 month duration of DAPT. So it really depends on where you want to draw the line. If you want to draw the line at a short duration of DAPT and you call it 1 month, there will be trials for the fluoropolymer and the second generation durable polymer and also biodegradable polymer stents, which will give you that data. And so you wonder, should I really use a bare metal stent? Sure, you can use short DAPT and get away with that surgery, but you're left with the risk of restenosis down the line. So let me ask you along those lines. I mean, do you use bare metal stents in your practice?
Well, not really. So I share all your comments. So we don't see any advantage anymore in using bare metal stent, and we generally prefer to use drug-eluting stent with an abbreviated course of dual antiplatelet therapy. We have also to mention that there is one randomized trial, which is the Leader's-Free trial, which compared the biofreedom stent against the bare metal stent, followed just with 1 month dual antiplatelet therapy. And in this trial, biofreedom stent was associated with significantly lower rates of cardiac mortality, myocardial infarction, and stent thrombosis. So not only target lesion and target vessel revascularization, but even in a hard endpoint like cardiac mortality, myocardial infarction, and stent thrombosis. So this trial is online with all these concepts we have been discussing about, and I really doubt there is any role anymore with the bare metal stent.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And again, we see this consistency in many different randomized trials. If you look at the Zeus trial, patients who are high risk of bleeding randomized to Endeavor, the fast-releasing Endeavor versus bare metal stents. And again, bare metal stents did pretty badly. I think it's important for people to understand this. Let me ask you another question. Do you think there are, now we have second, third generation drug-eluting stents. Are there meaningful differences within those stents? How do you make a decision of which stents to use in your practice?
Well, this is a great and difficult question. So I think it's unlikely that there is going to be differences in mortality between the second and third generation drug-eluting stent. But on the other hand, we cannot exclude that there may be differences in other endpoints, such as myocardial infarction and stent thrombosis. But now if you take, for example, stent thrombosis, and you assume, for example, a 1-year rate of stent thrombosis of 1%, and you assume a 50% relative risk reduction with the one stent in relation to another, with alpha 0.05 and power of 90%, you would need 13,000 patients to show this difference. And we have to acknowledge that we don't have such a trial around. So we have many trials, but unfortunately all these trials have a non-inferiority design. And you know that trials with non-inferiority design have many limitations because they combine heterogeneous endpoints such as death, myocardial infarction, and stent thrombosis, and so they are not powered for analyzing individual components of the primary endpoint, important components such as myocardial infarction or stent thrombosis. And worse than that, many of these trials turned out to be underpowered because there was an imbalance between expected event rates and observed event rates. So we have the general perception that all second generation drug-eluting stent and third generation drug-eluting stent are all good, are all created equals, but we have to admit that we don't have a real answer to your question.
So in terms of the second generation stents, I mean, you've shown with a number of your studies and some of the ongoing ones that the fluoropolymer cobalt chromium everolimus eluting stent has lower stent thrombosis. So let me ask you this. So is it the stent? Is it the polymer? Is it the drug? Is there a way to tease it out, or is it a combination of all of these factors?
Well, an excellent question. I think it's a combination of all these factors. If we look at all the data that we have in the literature, indeed we are doing the experiments analyzing the thrombogenicity of different drug-eluting stents. We have an in vitro model in which we put different stents, and we analyze at the end of 2-hour perfusion the amount of thrombus that has been generated within these stents. Now I can tell you that we have done some experiments showing that the fact that the stent has a fluoropolymer reduce significantly the amount of thrombus formation as compared to a bare metal stent. But the fluoropolymer is not the whole story, because if you compare a stent coated with fluoropolymer with Excience, the Excience still has lower rates of stent thrombosis, lower amount of thrombus formation as compared to the fluoropolymer. So there must be something else, like probably the interface between blood and the polymer and the drug. So this may be one possible reason. But I think that there are also data that the platform, and in particularly the strut, the thickness of the strut may have an important role. And so at this point, I know that you've been doing some studies about ultra-thin strut drug-eluting stent. So what can you tell us about that?
So one of the things that we've been trying to answer is we made significant progress, right? I mean, I think everybody agrees in the last 30 years, 3 decades, and of PCI, we have made significant progress reducing your event rates, whether it's TVR, stent thrombosis, etc. We've been reducing that. But interestingly, what has happened is, as you know, in 2009, our second generation stents were FDA approved. And since then, we have seen a plateau in terms of outcomes. I mean, there have been a number of other type of stents, biodegradable polymer stents, etc. All, as you were pointing out, it's all powered for non-inferiority. So, I feel that we weren't actually making progress in reducing events. I mean, the event rates are low, but we haven't made more progress in reducing it further.
But can I ask you a question? Is this because trials perhaps end up enrolling low-risk patients? And I mean, I think we should do trials in patients at high risk of ischemic events to tease out whether there is a difference, a real difference between different drug-eluting stents.
Absolutely. Otherwise, your point is absolutely well taken, because if you start with the event rates which are very low, you need a lot of patients. And the problem is also that the newer stents, at least a few years ago, were all designed to be non-inferior. And the real question is, do we need more non-inferior stents? Yes, to reduce the price of the stents, I mean, that's true, but not really to move the needle forward. And so what we did was we wanted to look at ultra-thin strut stents. I mean, we know from a number of basic bench and animal studies that the thinner the strut is, it's better. But is there a plateau effect? Beyond, once you get to a certain thinness, you have to balance between radial strength and various different properties. But will it actually reduce outcomes? So in a more recent paper, which will be published in Circulation soon, we looked at ultra-thin strutted stents, and there we defined the ultra-thin as less than 70 microns. We wanted to have at least a 10 micron difference between what we commonly use, the Xience, Promises, and other stents. And what we've shown in that analysis, again, I mean, it's not one study, it's a meta-analysis of many different trials, including many different thin-strutted, ultra-thin struts, stents, and what we showed is a reduction in stent thrombosis, reduction in MI at 1 year with these stents. So there is some signal. I mean, of course, this needs to be proven, but there is some signal that getting the strut thickness lower to around 60 to 70 microns may be the way to go in terms of better healing. Where do you see the field moving forward? I mean, I know that you have published a number of analysis looking at, we are doing great within the first year with second generation stents, but there is continued accrual of events after 1 year. So what would you like to see?
Well, I think that second and third generation drug-eluting stent have achieved incredible results and make incredible progress. But as you were pointing out, we still have a problem in the long-term follow-up. And even with the best-in-class generation second and third generation drug-eluting stent, we see that at long-term follow-up there is a steady accrual of events with no evidence of plateau. Why is that? I think this is because of the permanence of the metallic cage. I mean, even though the healing profile of this new generation drug-eluting stent has improved a lot as compared to first generation drug-eluting stent, there is still inflammation, there is still fibrin deposition, there is still late stent fracture, and more importantly, there is still neoatherosclerosis. Even with second generation drug-eluting stent, rates of neoatherosclerosis have been similar, at least in some reports, to first generation drug-eluting stent. I mean, how can we address this problem? I think the solution may be the fully bioresorbable scaffold. I mean, this may be the way to go to avoid late events. But unfortunately, this is just one hypothesis, because with the scaffold, with the absorbed stent, I mean, results have been disappointing, because we know from many randomized trials and meta-analysis that the scaffold was associated with increased rates of stent thrombosis, device thrombosis, target vessel myocardial infarction, ischemia-driven target lesion revascularization as compared to the Xylem stent. So I think the idea and the concept is there, but at the moment we still are looking for the right device.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think, we are trying to fix a temporary problem, which is a stenosis with a permanent implant. So hopefully we can fix this issue of scaffold thrombosis, and hopefully in the future we'll have a scaffold which will satisfy all our needs and at least provide that acute events, acute outcomes which are comparable to current generation drug-eluting stents.
So and I want to ask you the last question. DAPT duration, how long do you go with the second or third generation drug-eluting stent? 3 months, 6 months, 1 year, more than 1 year? What do you generally do?
So, I tend to individualize. I go in with the notion that the minimum required in patients who do not have acute coronary syndrome is 6 months. I start with that. And then it depends on the patient's anatomy. If I see a lot of patients with, diffuse disease, I've put in one stent, but there is a lot of diffuse disease, I tend to continue longer. If it is a more complex lesion, CTOs, bifurcation, etc., I tend to continue longer. On the other hand, if it is simple lesion, 6 months. If there are high risk of bleeding, I may even consider 3 months. I also have patients where it's a pre-op clearance for some surgery, and I'm okay with putting one of the fluoropolymer stents and 1 to 3 months of dual antiplatelet therapy and proceeding.
So do you factor more the complexity of coronary artery disease or some clinical variables such as peripheral arterial disease, chronic kidney disease, or?
I would say it's a combination of both. So we use sometimes the DAP score to guide our decision making, but it's complex, and so I tend to individualize. I'm just curious to hear your thoughts and how you make that decision.
I basically agree what you said. We have many trials and we have many meta-analyses, and we know from all this evidence that there is no doubt that prolonging dual antiplatelet therapy reduces the risk of myocardial infarction, reduces the risk of definite probable stent thrombosis, but increases the risk of bleeding, of major bleeding and any bleeding. So we have studied in depth the relation between duration of dual antiplatelet therapy, bleeding and mortality. And in a recent meta-analysis, we were able to show that prolonging that increases the risk of bleeding-related death as compared to shorter dual antiplatelet therapy, whereas there was no significant difference between the shorter versus longer DAP with respect to non-bleeding related death. So providing a mechanistic link between prolonged DAP, bleeding and mortality. So having said that, of course, for each patient you have to balance the risk of ischemic events, you have to balance the bleeding risk, and after you have to decide accordingly.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think we are in an interesting phase where we can individualize, and I think that's the key. At least back in the day it was as long as you can, but that's no longer true.
Absolutely.
So I think this was a fantastic discussion. Thank you everybody for joining, and hopefully this will be useful in your clinical practice.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.